Good morning, all. I now call this meeting of the Standing Committee on Economic Development Environment to order. My name is Ron Bonnetrus. I'm the MLA for the Detroit riding and also Deputy Chair of this committee. Our first order of business is to open our meeting with a prayer. I will lead us in the prayer this morning. My community also has heavy hearts as we lost a young elder late yesterday evening, and we got word of another passing this morning. And I thought I would do a prayer that may be appropriate. Lord of heaven, we rest underneath your mighty wings of love. We dwell within your gentle heart. We know there is healing in your touch through the sufferings of Christ. We ask for restoration and trust in your goodness. You are my Lord, my Savior, my healer, and my friend. We dwell within your gentle embrace. Amen.
Amen.
Our next item is the review and adoption of the agenda. Our first item is a public briefing on waste management from the Mckenzie Valley Land and Water Board. Clerk, can you walk us through the agenda, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We do have a presentation with the Mckenzie Valley Land and Water Board with Ms. Sheila Montgomery and Mr. Ryan Fickett. And then we have some in-camera matters which we will discuss after the public presentation is finished. Thank you.
I must see for that. Are there any additions or any changes to be made to the agenda? Seeing none, can I have a motion to approve the agenda as presented? Mr. Johnson. Motion is in order. All those in favor? We hear Katrina way over there. And having reviewed and adopted the agenda, are there any declarations of conflict of interest? Hearing none, and we can go as and when basis. Today, the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment is holding a public briefing on waste management in the Northwest Territories. Standing Committee has identified a priority to ensure the NWT is well positioned to prevent environmental liabilities, effectively manage contaminated sites, and stimulate local economic opportunities through remediation. In committee's work to advance this priority, the management of the NWT landfills has been identified as an opportunity to improve the management of contaminated sites in every community, as well as build remediation sites across the Northwest Territories. Today's meeting is being live streamed on the Assembly's social media channels. I would like to remind all members and witnesses that all comments, questions, and remarks will be directed to myself as the chair. Both members and the witness will need to wait to be recognized by the chair before speaking. I will now ask members to introduce themselves for the record, starting with the member in the room.
Rylan Johnson, MLA for Yellowknife North.
Ms. Knockleby.
Trina Knockleby, MLA for Great Slave. And Ryan is my constituent, by the way. Welcome, Ryan.
Okay, I will now invite is it Sheila Montgomery, the Executive Director of the Mckenzie Valley Land and Water Board, to introduce yourself and your staff and to proceed with your presentation. Let's see.
Thank you. Yes, Sheila Montgomery. I'm the Executive Director of the Mckenzie Valley Land and Water Board, and my colleague here is Ryan Fickett, the Executive Director of the Pkc Land and Water Board. And he will be leading the presentation, and we'll be just providing information as we go, and certainly are happy to take any questions during the presentation or after.
Perfect. Thank you again, guys, for the invitation to present to the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment and to explain the Land and Water Board's role in managing waste and contaminated sites. I understand we have approximately 10 minutes for this presentation, and there's additional time at the end for questions. Is that still the case, Mr. Chair?
Oh, sorry. Proceed with your presentation.
Sure, thank you. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so to set the context, it's important to recognize that the Land and Water Boards themselves come out of land claim agreements, and that there are actually two separate jurisdictions of land and resource management within the Northwest Territories. You can see the green area on the map on the left. On the top is the Inuvialuit Settlement Region, or the ISR. And that Inuvialuit final agreement was settled in 1984, and it was done so by virtue of amending existing legislation. The next area in the purple is the Gwich'in Comprehensive Land Claim Agreement, which was signed in 1992. The Satu Dene and Métis Comprehensive Land Claim Agreement in the red on the map was signed in 1993. And the Clecho Land Claims and Self-Government Agreement was signed in 2005 and is the dark blue area. And more recently, the Delaunay Self-Government Agreement was signed in 2015. And the first four of those agreements, you can just see the cover pages on the right. And it's just important to reiterate that these modern treaties clarify how renewable and non-renewable resources will be managed by different landowners, whom will do that regulation, how parties will work together when making decisions related to resources of the NWT. And by guaranteeing this consultation and participation in the environmental assessment, the regulatory and the land use planning processes, these modern treaties really give Indigenous groups in the Northwest Territories a significant say in land, water, and environmental management. It's also important to note that the signatories to these agreements wanted in legislation to ensure that inclusive, transparent, and collaborative decision-making took place. So through the signing of the first three treaties, or the agreement, sorry, a new piece of legislation was developed based on these principles and others set out in the land claims. And that was called the Mckenzie Valley Resource Management Act. And that created the co-management bodies that regulate land, water, and the environment. And that came into effect in 1998. Next slide, please. So for the purposes of today's presentation, this map just outlines the Mckenzie Valley region of the Northwest Territories, so it does not include the Inuvialuit Settlement Region, and this is the area to which the Mckenzie Valley Resource Management Act applies. And you can see that from each settled land claim, there is a Land and Water Board that was created, that came into being. And in the south part of the Mckenzie Valley and the Northwest Territories, the area identified in yellow is that area which does not currently have a settled land claim and is currently regulated by the Mckenzie Valley Land and Water Board in the interim. So next slide, please. So this legislation that came from the land claim agreements set out a regime of co-management. This is just one description of what that means in the context of the board's operation and waste management and regulation. Next slide, please. So the Land and Water Boards, I know this might look like standard legislative text, but the mandates that are set out in the land claims and then in the Mckenzie Valley Resource Management Act are very progressive, very unique, and dissimilar from any other legislation that we're aware of in the world. And some of the key words in this mandate that you can see is the well-being and way of life of Indigenous peoples. So this is a legislative obligation that the boards have to consider when making decisions. Similarly, the consideration of traditional knowledge and scientific information as two different information types is something that is within the legislation and a requirement of the boards in their decision-making process. Next slide, please. So what did the Land and Water Boards do? Why are we here talking to you guys today? Essentially, the Land and Water Boards make decisions about the regulation, the use of land and water and the deposit of waste. So the use of land and water and the deposit of waste. And that's usually done through authorizations such as a land use permit and or a water license. And before they do that, the boards need to make sure they're considering any approved land use plans that are that exist. And they always need to assess the impacts. And that's what a preliminary screening is. That's a process that the Land and Water Boards undertake. So essentially that's what the Land and Water Boards do on a day-to-day basis. Next slide, please. So where do the boards do this work? Well, you can see this map of the Northwest Territories shows a mosaic of land ownership. And the areas that are lightly colored are where Indigenous governments own surface rights, and the darker shaded areas are where Indigenous governments own surface and subsurface rights. And the important point to take away from this map is that regardless of the land ownership, the boards regulate up and down the Mckenzie Valley, with the exception of national parks, the Nahanni and the Wood Buffalo National Park. And they regulate all types of activities. So you can see just different types of activities and projects that we regulate, from all-season roads to mines to oil and gas exploration to remediation projects and municipalities, which I understand is one of the focuses of today's conversation. So all types of activities and in all areas of the Mckenzie Valley. Next slide, please. So the boards regulate projects, so entire municipalities, entire mines, entire mineral exploration programs, entire tourism operations. But in the context of the question that the committee has asked, we thought it might make most sense to share the role of the Land and Water Board specifically in the stages of a facility, the life cycle stages. The reason the yellow arrows are there is just to note that outside of an actual facility that we're talking about, the board's regulatory processes actually start way before submission even arrives at the board, because there's consultation and engagement that is required before a submission even comes in to the boards for consideration. And after a particular facility closes, there's post-closure monitoring that takes place for years or decades in some cases to make sure that the environment is safe and protected at the standards that everyone agreed to. So for the purposes of today, we thought we'd go through the life cycle of the facility, and we can think of this as a landfill. I know that's what the committee identified in its letter, but we can think of other municipal waste facilities like a sewage lagoon, water treatment plant, and keep in mind that many of these facilities exist outside of municipalities at industrial sites as well. So we do have landfills, water treatment plants, sewage lagoons, and other waste facilities like waste rock storage areas or tailings facilities that exist at some of the industrial sites. Next slide, please. So the committee asked about opportunities to ensure that contaminated sites are prevented when possible, managed better when we need to, and so the first thing is in the design. So before facilities even are proposed, all parties get an opportunity to look at the impacts of those facilities. So if it's a new project, it's a new facility, submissions come in that require approval from the board. These type of submissions undergo the board's public review process. So it's available to all parties and the public to weigh into and provide evidence to the board. And it's a very transparent system where the board then makes a decision based on the evidence on the record. Also, when designing these facilities, landfills or waste rock storage areas, there are many guidelines that are available. In the area of landfills specifically, that is one area that we think there could be more work done, but there is a lot of guidance for applicants and folks designing these facilities. Next slide, please. We thought it would be helpful to just also show the GWT's role, because this is a co-management system, and so the boards are making decisions, but it's based on the evidence provided by all parties, and the GWT does play a very substantive role in contributing to this decision-making process. So when the boards are looking at impacts, they're undergoing that preliminary screening process. Other government bodies, such as the GWT, the federal government, Indigenous governments, have roles to also contribute to that preliminary screening process. And in most cases, all other organizations rely on the board's process. So it's a very important process to make sure we get it right. And as you've probably heard from the newspapers, you know, when projects are big enough or the impacts might cause a significant environmental impact, it goes off to environmental assessment, which is managed by our partners at the review board. But GWT has a very important role in that preliminary screening process. The GWT and the Land and Water Boards have produced dozens of guidelines and policies over the last 13 years jointly, because we recognize that it doesn't work if the GWT or the boards are doing this in a silo. So there's many, many examples of waste management type guidelines, closure guidelines, and other things where we have worked together. And then GWT, ENR, and lands hold significant expertise in water management, water quality, you know, land access, those types of questions that come up during the board's processes. So these two departments particularly play a very significant role in providing the expertise that not always other parties within the Mackenzie Valley have the time or the expertise or capacity to provide. Next slide, please. So hopefully we've done everything we can to design it properly from the beginning, but sometimes we also take on facilities that are already under operations. And I guess that's probably very similar to what this committee is considering when looking at existing landfills and how to deal with a lot of the legacy sites. So we do have inspectors on the ground, both federal and territorial inspectors that are out there and enforcing the conditions of these licenses and permits. So all these municipalities, all these industrial sites, they have to abide by the conditions in their licenses and permits, and the inspectors are on the ground right there, and that's their role. For a lot of the municipal facilities and also industrial facilities, landfills, sewage lagoons, water treatment plants, there are operations and maintenance plans. This is a specific type of plan that describes and makes sure everyone knows how it's supposed to operate. Again, these plans are for board approval, and anything that undergoes board approval in this co-management system is subject to public review. So it goes out for public review for a time, and all parties in the public are able to provide their input and expertise. And at the end of the day, the board will make a decision based on that evidence on the record. For any operations that have a water license, so that's most municipalities in the Mackenzie Valley, there is requirements for ongoing monitoring, so water quality monitoring all throughout and around the site. And there is also a requirement for an annual report. So once a year, they have to make sure they are reporting on how much waste they're depositing, you know, how much sludge is in the water treatment plant, how the landfill is going, is it on track, is it on schedule, you know, are they going to need more room, any issues, things like that. So during the operations of facilities, there's a lot of oversight that happens both on the ground and from the office, and the public has opportunities to look at those ongoing monitoring reports that come in on typically a monthly basis and that annual report. Next slide, please. The picture on the right was the Pkc facility at Diabek, for anyone interested. A process kimberlite containment facility. Again, GWT's role in operations, both ENR and lands have compliance and enforcement divisions, so they have inspectors, depending if it's a water license or a land use permit that needs to be inspected. There are guidance documents. The GWT and the Land and Water Boards produced operation and maintenance plan templates for municipalities to help them, basically fillable PDFs that, you know, make sure that the information that comes in is very clear and easy, trying to just help them get those operations and maintenance plans in place. GWT MACA plays a significant role when it comes to communities in helping them manage their waste. They're often providing either funding to get expertise for engineers or consultants to prepare plans or designs for these facilities, but there's definitely some room there for improvements. And again, the inspectors are reviewing those monitoring reports to ensure compliance. So they're not just on the ground, but they're also looking at the submissions that come in too. Next slide. So regardless of how well we all did collectively, you know, with these facilities, overseeing these facilities during their operations. What really matters at the end of the day is closure, because we all want to make sure that the land is safe for the end land users. So any of the municipalities or the industrial sites that have licenses also have closure plans, and these require, again, board approval, which means they will go on for public review, and members of the public and all parties have that opportunity to provide their input and concerns and ideas into that process. A really important aspect is securities. So securities is the amount of money held to ensure that third-party cleanup could take place. This is in place for non-government projects. So municipalities are not subject to this requirement. There is no security held for municipalities, understandably, but for sites outside of municipal boundaries, our mines, for example, oil and gas exploration programs, things like that, an amount of security is set and held by the landowner. Typically, it's the government of the Northwest Territories in most cases. And that money is set aside so that if the company gets up and leaves and walks away, there is security to clean up that. And it's always estimated at third-party costs because those are higher, to make sure that there's enough money covered. And again, at the end of the day, the inspectors are on the ground, making sure that they're operating and closing down the facility in accordance with that approved closure plan. And then long after a site closes, there's post-closure monitoring. That may be erosion monitoring for a sewage lagoon. It may be groundwater monitoring wells for a landfill site. There's lots of different types of post-closure monitoring, including wildlife and other things that gets included in these requirements. Next slide, please. And again, the GWT's role in this, GWT, E&R, and lands play a very important role in setting up the closure objectives and criteria. So for a lot of our industrial sites, because they're building these new facilities like mines, we go through the full closure planning process and develop closure objectives and criteria. And what those essentially mean is closure objectives are what we're trying to achieve. So if we want a flat piece of land that can be reforested or used for some other type of end use, that's our closure objective, and the criteria is how we know that gets achieved. So the criteria are the standards, whether narrative or numerical, that ensure that we've met our closure objectives. And so not all existing facilities in municipal boundaries have closure objectives and closure criteria. But that is more common for sites, waste management sites outside of municipal boundaries. And as I mentioned, GWT, E&R, and lands, they determine the form of security and they hold it. And like I said, it's most of the GWT, but it's actually technically the landowner. So in some cases, Indigenous governments may choose to hold that on their lands for projects on their lands. And again, the inspectors play a very, very important role to ensure that at the end of the day, the closure objectives have been achieved. And they are the ones on the ground signing off, checking the checklist if there's anything missing before that security is returned back to the proponents. Next slide, please. So to summarize some of the biggest challenges that I guess we believe exist, the technical guidance. So a lot of the other provinces and territories have technical guidance on landfills and sewage lagoons and groundwater monitoring. We understand that the remoteness of some of the sites, the cost of doing work up here is a limiting factor, but there are no specific technical guidance for the design and operation of landfills for the Northwest Territories, and that has been identified in previous water strategies and environmental audits as a concern, and that's certainly something that we recognize would assist. The capacity of communities, because you asked about landfills, which are typically in municipal boundaries, many of the communities have changed over, as you know, in their senior administrative officers and staff, and don't always have the expertise. And this is where MACA comes in to be able to manage these sites. To be honest, of all of the water licenses throughout the Mckenzie Valley, almost no community is in full compliance with their water license. And this is an issue that the Land and Water Boards have brought up to the Minister of MACA over the last several years because they need more support, not just from the government, not just internal capacity, and the inspectors on the ground. there are, while we recognize there is only a finite amount of resources available to do everyone's job, one of the things that we also have noticed is there are certain programs that are duplicative. For example, the community-based monitoring program is a great initiative, but with the surveillance network program, that's the ongoing monitoring that takes place in these communities. Those two programs could be aligned and are actually taking away from one another and making it harder for the communities to carry out their legally obligated sampling. And the SWP is the Source Water Protection Plan, Planning and Water Licensing. Again, these are two initiatives that are very close in purpose, but are taking away people's time and resources to do both. The other challenge is the enforcement capacity, and by capacity, we just want to be clear, we're not talking about the individual's expertise on the ground, we're talking about the resources to fund them. The Land and Water Boards have written letters to the ministers and deputy ministers about the unavailability of inspection reports and the timing it takes to get inspection reports. And if those are the folks that are on the ground who are using their expertise to ensure that the environment is kept safe, they need more help, not less help. They need more resources to get out on the land and make sure that the licenses and permits are being complied with. And the last one is the lack of relinquishment process. So for those projects where security is held, there is no process for, at the end of the day, a release of liability. And that's what we mean by relinquishment. There is processes for returning of funds. So as you clean up your site, you get more and more money back. But at the end of the day, there's no final process or decision from the folks holding the money, which is typically the GMT, on how that liability is released, if at all. And that's been something that the boards have been asking to work with the GMT on for more than 10 years. And our second last slide, if you please. So it's a big list here, but we tried to articulate some of the solutions. I know the top bullet of settlement claims is not an easy one, but it definitely provides certainty with respect to land ownership, land access. It provides land claim implementation funding from the federal government. It gives these communities capacity. There is a noticeable difference in compliance and capacity when you look at areas that have settled land claims and areas that don't. And this is a big dichotomy in our system, and settling these land claims and helping ensure everyone has the same ability to put their voice into the decision-making process is important. And I think I spoke to all of the other solutions. Maybe just the last bullet on this slide, the legislative amendments. There are different pieces of legislation that exist that the government of those territories is bound by. The biggest disconnect from the perspective of the Land and Water Boards is the fact that the Mckenzie Valley Resource Management Act is a very progressive, unique piece of legislation that sets out the board's roles and responsibilities, and the Environmental Protection Act has a lot of teeth when it comes to enforcement. And those are two separate pieces of legislation that don't align. And there was many discussions a few years back about how to align those two pieces of legislation, whether it was harmonizing them, whether it was rolling them together. We went through various conversations back and forth, and ultimately some of those legislative amendments got stalled because Indigenous governments weren't happy. So there are legislative things we can do to fix the system, to make it easier for everyone else, and to make sure that, for example, a water license doesn't expire, and without making sure the proper security or the proper closure planning is in place. Next slide. And that is it for our presentation, and we're happy to answer questions. Masi.
Masi, for your presentation. I will ask the members if they have any questions for the board. We'll start with Katrina.
Trying to find my mute here. Thank you for the presentation. I actually really don't have a lot of questions. This is an area where I have done work and I'm pretty familiar with. So perhaps if the question in A, I might get spurred to ask something else, but at this time I just say thank you to both, and welcome Sheila too. I realized I only welcomed Ryan earlier, but I don't have any questions for the board. Yes, got to think of the votes, right, Sheila? So I'm good. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, I guess we're not getting questions because of the votes. I'm joking. We'll go to Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the camera faced the other way, so I'm going to turn around here. Can you just give... So thank you for that list of current issues. I think that kind of accurately reflects exactly why committee is starting down this path, and we will be tabling a number of reports kind of on contaminated sites. We're also going to have toured and we'll continue to tour a number of landfills for that exact issue of the vast majority are out of compliance with their water license. Can you just elaborate on that a little? I know there's a large kind of list of factors here, but what is preventing, an inspector from just issuing an order to a municipality to come into compliance with their water license, and then that being done? There's kind of, using a hammer to get these licenses in compliance, or is it just that we need to fund them more? Or I'm just trying to kind of understand why we let this out of compliance go on for so long. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. There are 28 communities that are within the Mackenzie Valley region. 21 of those have water licenses. Okay, so approximately 3/4 of them. So there's an issue where there isn't a tool in place to even regulate some of these communities or facilities. So that's one issue. The second, I guess, more specific to your question, is where there is licenses, what are some of the barriers that the inspectors face? Well, first, they have to get to those communities, and their budgets have been decreased substantially over the past few years. I know for a fact it's been challenging during COVID, but they certainly have less resources to get out more often, not as frequently as they would like to. So that's certainly like a funding issue. There is nothing stopping an inspector from issuing an order, but understanding that the difference, in a community is if you issue an order to fix something and the community doesn't have the expertise and the manpower and the funding to deal with it, that's the reality of the situation for the communities.
Let's see,
If I
Mr.
may,
Johnson.
Here, I would just add of course, the question about why inspectors are not potentially going to sites is really a question for enforcement and compliance of GNWT. So just our observations and from meetings, as Ryan mentioned, they lack resources. I mean, our staff for the municipal files themselves do track those. We have across the 4 boards, staff work together as a team and try to track those, and certainly some of those communities with municipal water licenses have never had an inspection. There's a couple that have had inspections as of 2020, but most of them are maybe 2017, 2018, or even earlier than that. So not very regular. So compliance, we as the Land and Water Board managing these authorizations are not even aware whether they are in compliance or not. We know from the reporting side whether they're in compliance or not, but as far as some of the other potential activities, seepages from landfills, that's not really something that we are on the ground to see. That's the role of the inspectors. As for issuing orders, we've had discussions with compliance enforcement at a high level, so ED to ADM. At times, we do have trouble getting uptake commitment from divisions, departments within GNWT responsible for compliance and enforcement to get the real people at the table to have these discussions. But there certainly is a reluctance, and it's the operations of the enforcement and compliance divisions, but to issue these orders, and it's somewhat understandable, I guess, with a municipality. What would that be? A stop work order? You're not allowed to deliver water to community. You're not allowed to pick up waste and deposit it in a landfill. What could a significant enforcement issue be for a municipality, these small communities? And as Ryan mentioned, and as the boards recognize, they struggle. They don't have the capacity, financial or human, in a lot of ways to even apply for a water license or to manage one once it's maintain one once it's in place. So I think, as we indicated, it really there's certainly a role for MACA in that, in supporting the communities as far as we understand, and then perhaps the committee will be able to have a discussion with the compliance and enforcement people responsible for that activity. Thank you.
I would just add to your point, Rylan, or to your question, that, I mean, the inspectors and the boards are generally aware of the issues that exist in municipalities to some extent. And an example of where the rubber hits the road is, a couple of years ago, you may recall the sewage lagoon in Bachoco failed. That was something that the boards and the inspectors were well aware of and were advising the community on how to deal with that in advance. There was engineering reports that were overdue, inspections that were overdue, erosion monitoring that wasn't being carried out. And so the operations of that existing facility had a real impact. It had an impact when it breached and flooded the wetland downstream, and luckily it didn't affect the drinking water, or we would have had some pretty serious public health issues. But that's a real issue that we're aware of, and that's not just in that community, and that's not just the issue. There's many issues like that in many communities across the NWT.
All right, must see for Sheila and Ryan for your comments. Mr. Johnson, anything further?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Sheila and Ryan. Yeah, okay, I think that's helpful just in the ever competing world for GNWT dollars. It seems that committee should focus its first recommendations on kind of building that expertise and technical advice in MACA. If I have to prioritize that and increased enforcement, I think that's kind of where we go. Another thing that's kind of driving some of this work is the Auditor General and the new public accounting standards are going to ask all public governments to have a liability for, all the hazardous waste they have, returning all end-of-life buildings to landfills, disposing of any asbestos, and GNWG is just starting that work. But I think you can imagine the scale of us accounting for putting every one of our buildings into a landfill is billions of dollars in liability that the public accounts will then reflect. And I think that's spurred a bit of a kind of a rush to realize the state of some of our landfills and reassess their life capacity. And I think that's one of the reasons committee wants to head down this, is that there's actually cost savings. If you can actually just properly run your landfill and waste management from day one, everybody wins. The municipality gets a longer life. It costs less money. And that's a question we're going to have with a couple of municipalities and a couple of kind of people who are experts in that area. But I guess I'll pose that question to you as you do, deal with the design. If you're getting a new, kind of where are some of the biggest gaps right now in landfills specifically, and how we're just not running them properly? If we were going to design all new landfills for new communities from scratch, like what would they be doing differently? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Let's see, Mr. Johnson, Ms. Montgomery. Excuse me.
Or Ryan, forget.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To your question, Rylan, probably the two things that jump into my mind are, before we even operate them, of course, having guidance on how to properly design and site them. That's something that doesn't exist. There is no specific technical guidance related to the design of landfills in the Northwest Territories. So that's the first one. And then once we're operating them, one of the big disconnects or misalignments that we had mentioned in our challenges is right now there are various programs, groundwater monitoring programs that are run by MACA that are required by the water licenses that the boards regulate. And a lot of these requirements, there's no plan, there's no strategy on how they should happen. And sometimes we don't even know that there's groundwater monitoring wells being monitored by a different regulator at the site for a landfill for a different reason. And so having guidance to not be wasting and duplicating money and resources, and actually ensuring that the operation of those landfills follows some kind of standard operation and maintenance plan, and the monitoring of it is standardized, like the groundwater monitoring wells, and that is coordinated amongst all regulators. So that's one of the best ways we can make sure that it's operating effectively.
Yeah, if I may, to Sheila here, just on that point, there is a guidance document that Environment and Climate Change Canada issued in March of 2017. It's solid waste management for northern and remote communities, planning and technical guidance document. And the boards have adopted that in the interim. There are some gaps in it, but it is something that is available on our websites as resources for municipalities. So there is that starting point. We can certainly send you the link to that to your committee clerk if you wish to have it as part of your reference materials.
Mussy for that. Anything further, Mr. Johnson?
No, I believe Emily Knockleby has some questions.
Ms. Knockleby?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, just listening to this, and I apologize if you said this or talked about this already, but it seems to me a lot of our issues are just that the landfills are not gated and they're not manned or staffed. So, you could have all the landfills set up as greatly as you wanted, et cetera, but then once if people are just going to come in and throw everything around willy-nilly. So I'm just curious to know if there's been a movement towards, and I understand a lot of times it's capacity in the community and ground level almost education of community members maybe, or municipal members where they should be putting different things in the landfill. So I'm just kind of curious around that and any changes in that area.
Oops. Ms. Montgomery?
Okay. Thanks, Katrina, for that question. I would say, yes, you're right. It doesn't matter how good you design it. If you don't operate it properly, it all goes out the door. I can say that from our experience at the Pkc Waterboard in bigger communities, there is definitely a better understanding over the last few years of, installing a gate, for example, at the landfill or the sewage lagoon and helping educate the community. But again, without kind of the inspectors being able to get there as frequently as they like, and without ensuring that communities even have the personnel in place to put in that gate and to watch it and to help educate people, without those things happening, you're definitely going to run into a lot of the issues that we see. So there has been progress, slow and definitely not fast enough, but I think people are starting to understand the consequences as communities, landfills get closer to the end of their operational life and they need to build new ones, and they're starting to realize what that means and looks like. So yeah, definitely, absolutely more support and resources are needed in that space.
Yeah. And Sheila here, just to add to that, an important requirement of our water licenses when a municipality has one of the surveillance network program, which is the essentially monitoring of potential off-site contamination as a result of, for example, a solid waste landfill or sewage lagoon. But those SNP, so surveillance network program monitoring stations, are established in the water license and are expected to be sampled at various intervals with the results. So it's a suite of parameters get analyzed by a lab, and those results are to be submitted as part of annual reporting on their water license. And the capacity for the communities to do that sampling is very different from community to community. And our regulatory staff have been working across the 4 land and water boards to put together quite simple, plain language, ready to use SNP sampling protocols, guidance for each community. So it includes a map of the community and actually shows where those SNP stations are so people know where to go. Our staff have gone out often with an inspector as well with the resource people in the community to actually do the sampling with them and help with training. But that's, as coming back to Katrina's question, I mean, the municipality, there may be a gate around the landfill, but there's that other off-site sampling that needs to be done to ensure that there's not leaching or some sort of contamination happening. And that again comes back to that training, and whether we continue to do that. We're willing and sort of able to do that, but that would certainly be another role we could imagine for MACA personnel potentially. Thank you.
Let's see for that, Ms. Knockleby.
And I do appreciate it's interesting, like when Ryan, you were mentioning earlier the abundance of people out there sampling with sort of no real idea of what each other is doing. All the wells are in different states of disrepair or repair. Sometimes you can't even find them. It seems to me, and I know this is obviously going to come back to money again, but like there obviously needs to be some sort of repository or database created of water data in the north. And I'm sure there's something that maybe exists, but it's almost like you have to sort of file with the Aurora Research Institute when you're doing scientific projects. Like there's got to be a way at some point to collate all of that data and information and create a better, more robust network. But I'm just going to guess the response to that is there's just no money for anything like that. I guess just that was more of a comment then. And then further to that, I guess to me, what I see is here's a great regional economic opportunity or employment opportunity to start ensuring that sort of every community and organization kind of has like a waste specialist. I don't know. And so maybe that's something more for committee, but I see that as something as a way we could get employment into small communities is to start doing diploma training so not a full degree program. Do you see that as feasible? Sort of having a community member that becomes almost like the liaison between all these groups and just becomes a waste specialist per se? Thanks.
I'm going to do CBM.
Let's see, Ms. Knockleby. Sheila or Ryan?
Katrina, the funny thing is that an opportunity that exists right before our eyes is that the community-based monitoring program is an initiative through the water strategy where communities are asked, what do they care about in their communities, and they're given, and there's resources, there's personnel, there's even technology training to go out and do that sampling. The crazy thing from our perspective is that communities enjoy doing that instead of the surveillance network program sampling that they're required to do legally by their water license. So for us, that's like an easy win-win where those two programs could be aligned, where there's already resources, already personnel, already expertise, and we help ensure the communities are actually accomplishing all the required sampling and people are ensuring that their water and the environment is safe. So no new resources necessarily needed, just an alignment of programs instead of two silos that are taking away from each other. So that, to me, like that's one of the alignment opportunities in the solutions that we talked about.
You mentioned the data stream.
And then the data stream to your other question about the data, there actually is a single place called the Mckenzie data stream where the community-based monitoring is going And they have recently started harvesting all the data from the Land and Water Board's S&P reports and A&P reports. So that is a place where community members or the public can go and look at the water quality in this river. So that's a place where that's actually happening in a usable way and accessible way. And they're always working to make that better too. So.
All right, Mussy, Ms. Knockleby.
No, that's good. And then here I am saying I don't have questions, and you probably said that in your presentation, so I apologize. But yeah, no, I appreciate the sort of hard rock you're behind at times, because I had a friend that was doing water treatment up here and such, and basically it was like the boil water advisories were there because nobody will take the sample. It's not necessarily that, you know, the water is bad per se. It's just to actually get the proof together, and it was really hard. They found to get people to just take the samples. So I appreciate the struggle here, but I think we can take some of this away from our committee and hopefully influence the departments to work with you guys. And yeah, more of a comment. Thanks.
Let's see, Ms. Knockleby, Sheila or Ryan would like to reply to that comment or any comments?
I think we just say thank you. We look forward to the potential
Working there.
yeah, collaboration and work, whatever you can do to help improve that.
All right, Mussy, for that. As we don't have any other members online or anything, I have some questions here. I wanted to refer back to page 15, where you had a lot of I guess I can't remember what the word was, but you got lots of initials like a CBM, SNP, SWP, and WL. I'm wondering if you can explain those ones to us. Mussy.
Here, thanks. And apologies for the use of acronyms. I hate that. Slides just aren't big enough. The CBM is the community-based monitoring program that the GNWT runs through the Department of Environment and Natural Resources that we just spoke about, where communities are kind of asked what they want to know about, and they are given technology and resources and training to go out and make that sampling happen, and all that information is collected in the Mckenzie data stream. The surveillance network program is the regulatory monitoring that's required by water licenses, which communities are, you know, as Sheila mentioned, it's different, the level of their ability to complete their required sampling from community to community. And this is one area that we have been in discussions with for many years about these programs could easily be aligned to kill two birds with one stone. The other two acronyms are the Source Water Protection Planning initiative from the GNWT, and WL stands for water licensing. So in response to Ryland's first question, we mentioned that 75% of the communities have a water license within the Mckenzie Valley. There are still 7 who don't. And so the water license is the tool up here in this co-management system to ensure source water protection. It is the tool that identifies what monitoring has to happen, what levels of waste can be discharged, how it needs to be managed. Source water protection planning is something down south that we hear about a lot. And recently there has been funds that have been allocated to the Source Water Protection Planning Initiative in the GNWT. Again, we see that process as is one and the same. Source water protection and water licensing is the same thing, and could be those dollars and those personnel and those resources could be used to ensure that the other 25% of communities actually get water licenses in place. So we have tools to enforce. We have all the public transparent processes in place to approve all those designs and the operations and maintenance plans and those kinds of things.
Very mussy for that. You also, on that page there, the third bullet, you state the overlap and duplication of efforts and programs. And I note that these efforts and the duplication go through about 4 departments, while your board, the Land and Water Board, Lands Department, ENR, and MACA. I know Lands does have some inspectors, as they've been going around people's yards and homes, and there's a big outcry about them, so we know they're around. has anybody even, met amongst each others to determine who should be doing the actual inspections? Because I don't think we need inspections from every department, but a centralized inspection agency department. What are your comments on that, Mussy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ryan here. Just to clarify, that third bullet was really about the duplication of efforts and programs related to waste management and water quality. And primarily those programs, community-based monitoring and source water protection, are run through the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. So ideally, with some direction, the GWT and the boards could come together and align those programs to make the best use of the limited resources. With respect to your comment about the inspections, I would just note, I guess, the Land and Water Boards in the Mackenzie Valley are one of the only administrative tribunals in the country that do not manage its own inspection division. It is set up different up here in the Northwest Territories. There's many reasons for that, but certainly the fact that there are inspectors underneath both the Department of Environment and Natural Resources and the Department of Lands, and then there are another group of diamond mine inspectors also under lands, has at times caused confusion and ineffectiveness from the board's perspective when managing issues and trying to deal with things.
Yeah, Mussy for that. I also wanted to, I wasn't quite sure or clear because there was an inquiry from the community about quarries. And we weren't sure, well, the minister's department didn't come back with an answer, so they weren't sure either, I suppose, as who regulates quarries. Does your department look after that? Mussy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ryan here. And I'll let Sheila chime in after if she wants to add anything. So yes, the Land and Water Boards regulate quarries. It's one of the activities that triggers the threshold of the Mackenzie Valley Land Use Regulations. There are quarries that exist within municipal boundaries that either predate water licenses or are exempt from the Land and Water Board's regulation. I know that the Department of Lands and the Department of ENR have worked very hard recently to develop guidelines on acid rock drainage for quarries within municipal boundaries that are not regulated by a permit or a license from the Land and Water Boards. So that is actually an ongoing conversation between the boards and between lands and ENR about the best way to ensure that no quarry goes unmanaged or unregulated, considering recent events in the past few years. And also that the requirements of the Land and Water Boards and that of lands are aligned. So that is actually a very timely topic.
Yeah, and Sheila here, I could just add that even outside of municipal boundaries, so the quarries, so a company comes along, they wish to operate a quarry. In order for them, and if they trigger the need for a land use permit, in order for them to apply for a land use permit, they first need to obtain a quarry permit that's issued by the GNWT,
Or the landowner.
which or the landowner, but they need a quarry permit that tells the Land and Water Board that they have the right to be on that parcel of land that is going to be their quarry. And what the Land and Water Board then issues is a land use permit, and that allows them to do the activity. But the Land and Water Boards don't have any role in saying an applicant is allowed to be on the land. They need some sort of a mineral claim, a mineral lease, a land lease, a quarry permit, all of which are issued currently by the vast majority through GNWT. And then they come to us and they have to prove that they have the right to be on the land, and then the Land and Water Boards only regulate the activities. And so with the quarries, coming back to those, so there is this quarry permit issuance of the GNWT primarily, which there is, I think, an engagement process through that where GNWT, through lands, lets people know in the vicinity. I'm not even sure about the individuals, but they let Indigenous governments and other governments know and have an opportunity to comment. But there is a little bit of potential overlap, and we're working on that as well at the moment through guidance that the GNWT has developed for quarry plans, quarry operations, pit development plans, and in our land use permits for quarries, there's a somewhat similar plan, and we're just doing some work now, our staff, to ensure that there's not this duplication or opposing requirements of something that GNWT is making a proponent do, and that the land and water boards are requiring under a land use permit. So that's an area of current potential overlap or conflict that we are working through now.
You mentioned quite the onerous process for businesses outside of the municipalities. What about within the municipality?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ryan here. The process is the same. Anyone applying to do any activities has to demonstrate they have the right or access to be on that land. In the case of a municipality doing something within their own boundaries, that's easy for them to demonstrate typically, but the process, the public process where people get input on those proposed activities is the same. The only difference sometimes between within a municipal boundary and outside of a municipal boundary is the triggers for what types of activities might require a permit or license. But the process is the same.
Okay, Mussy, for that. I'll just stray away from that at this point. There was also mention about leaching of waste disposal, waste from fuel tank farms, fuel station areas, by trains, car washes, gas bars, and there's probably many that are not too far from the main waterway, or else they would leach. Even the waste disposal areas that are known to leach into the main waterways. Are there, I know the question may have been asked, but I'm just wondering if there's anything on the horizon on how to address these or to help businesses or communities to prevent the leaching. Mussy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ryan here. I think the first thing I would add is that for communities where they have a water license in place, so that's 21 of the 28 in the Mckenzie Valley, a standard requirement for these municipalities is to have a spill contingency plan, which is about the management, the storage, the use of fuel and petroleum, and a waste management plan, which typically also covers general waste management and sometimes some specific waste management at facilities. So between those two plans and between the inspector on the ground, that's how spills are caught and remediated or prevented in the first place. And for new facilities, of course, they have to submit design drawings and go through that approval process. But for existing facilities, which there are many that we all are responsible for, it's through those plans and through the inspector's diligence on the ground that those things are managed. So if the inspector is not able to, if there's not enough inspectors, the inspectors can't get there, to witness or see leaching from a railroad or a fuel containment facility, there will be no instructions to clean it up. And often the communities themselves, as we've already discussed, have pretty minimal capacity to sometimes even identify these issues without the expertise of inspectors on the ground.
I think in terms of, you mentioned also, Mr. Chair, that, private businesses, so a gas bar, or those are not regulated under a municipality's water license. The water license is for their municipal operations, so they may have fuel storage that would be covered, or their landfill, their sewage lagoon, etc. But I believe, in order to have a gas bar and have fuel storage, there are regulations under Environment and Climate Change Canada for tanks, how they have to be constructed, maintained, monitored. So there is an inspection arm under Environment and Climate Change Canada. Also, I guess for other potential instances, the Environmental Protection Act of the territorial government, there's inspection opportunities and compliance enforcement under that as well. That has quite broad-reaching capacity, and I believe there have been in the recent years complaints or investigations spurred by local complaints about potential for acidic drainage coming out of an area even within the Niven Lake development. So there are other opportunities or other requirements or mandates of under other legislation and other government agencies for inspection and management of potential spills where the land and water boards do not have the authorization or mandate.
When the federal government gets involved in issues like this, they're quite a ways away from us. And it adds confusion to the GNWT departments. Because I've asked this numerous times to, I think, the ENR lands ministers, and it always refers back to the federal government regulations. And I'm always at the mindset that the GNWT should be regulating its own, even if you had to mirror federal regulations, as devolution has done. And I'm still scratching my head on that one. But anyways, if there are no further questions from committee, we'd like to thank you, Sheila and Ryan, for joining us today. This concludes the public portion of our meeting, and we will wait direction from Committee Clerk when we're off the live streaming. Merci.